I felt like I really wanted to address the largest problems for animals. I wanted to address the meat industry and specifically factory farming and animal testing and wildlife management and the fur trade. And that, well, the only way you can do this is to create standards in society. And standards basically are moral and kind of cultural and normative standards, but they're also legal standards. And I felt like this has to be where our movement goes.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
Well, today, folks, we are both pretty thrilled and very grateful to get to spend time with Wayne Pacelle. Wayne is a graduate of Yale University and is one of the leading contemporary animal advocates in the world, having founded or led a set of major animal rights organizations. He has led efforts to pass 1,500 state laws for animals, more than 100 federal laws and amendments, 30 ballot initiatives, and 500 corporate agreements. And in his free time, he wrote not one, but 2 books, both New York Times bestsellers, titled The Bond, Our Kinship with Animals and Our Call to Defend Them, and also The Humane Economy, How Innovators and Enlightened Consumers Are Transforming the Lives of Animals. Both Alexandra and I have had the honor to work with him on a variety of animal issues, from the Kangaroos Are Not Shoes global campaign to the current work Switch for Good and Wayne's organization Animal Wellness Action are partnering on to bring soy milk into U.S. public schools so that the almost 30 million children who milk makes sick will have a fair and just choice at the lunch counter. Wayne is the founder of Animal Wellness Action and the president of Center for a Humane Economy. Because why run one organization when you can run 2? He was also the president and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States for 14 years, tripling the budget and net assets of the organization and transformed it into the largest global organization for animals. Wayne might be one of the most productive humans I have ever worked with, and I have learned more from him than I can list here, not only on how to fight for the rights of animals and humans within the confines of our government, but how to run an effective organization. So this is going to be a good one, friends. Let's dive in. Welcome, Wayne.
Wow, what a kind introduction. I am not worthy, but thank you so much. And I'm so glad to be on your fabulous podcast, one of the best podcasts out there.
Yes, right? Well, we've wanted you on for a while, so we are stoked. There's no better place to begin than the beginning. And you grew up enjoying reading natural history books and developed a very early connection about the treatment of animals. How did you develop so early such a concern for animals that then it's obviously become your life's work?
Well, Dotsie, I've looked back, and this is one reason why I wrote The Bond. And it's interesting to think about your own experience and Alexandra's experience. Mm-hmm. And how do we get this? How does this idea develop? How does it germinate? How does it grow? And my conclusion is that this connection to nature and animals, it's built into every one of us. Number one, we're a social being. We need interactions with others in order to be whole and complete. And why should those social interactions stop at our species line? I mean, non-human animals are beautiful. They are incredibly athletic. They can run fast. They can fly. They can be so elegant in all of their movements. Why should a kid not be dazzled and amazed by the non-human world? And I think that this kind of pro-social instinct that we have from the youngest age, and then just seeing animals and their incredible characteristics, it doesn't take much then to feel empathy and appreciation and fascination. And as I, was a kid and like taking in as a city kid as much as I could by reading about animals and watching nature shows, that instinct that I had just became more grounded and real. And then when I got to college, I really began to understand there was a larger set of problems that exist for animals. There was factory farming, and there was animal testing, there was trophy hunting and the fur trade. And I thought, I don't want to be a bystander here. I mean, I care about animals. It's not just a personal thing for me that I love to see animals and I'm fascinated by them. It's like they matter. Every one of them matters. And it's not just my dog. It's all animals. And I thought, well, I'm going to do something about it. And I started an animal group when I was a sophomore at Yale.
A lot of kids love animals, but they don't dedicate their entire life to making animals safer and healthier and just happier on this planet. You went to Yale, you majored in history and environmental science. Did you have a plan when you were at Yale to then go on and somehow be involved with the natural world and specifically animals, or did something happen?
Yeah, it was just one of these things that was just growing in me every day. And you start to make connections. And frankly, you test your ideas with others, right? And I remember when I started an animal advocacy group, I was talking about it. And actually go back a year before that. So I was freshman year, I was really talking about animals before I started the group. And I was like questioning hunting and I was questioning animal testing. Then people were saying, well, you're eating animals. How could you, reconcile that behavior with this viewpoint that you're espousing? And frankly, they weren't trying to make a debating point. They were just trying to kind of have a get out of jail pass for them morally as well. Like they didn't want to take this to the logical, end, which is that you try to look at how all of us are interacting with animals, whether it's living animals right in front of us, or it's animals that are part of a supply chain where the animals are, killed 1,000 miles or 3,000 miles away. And I could not help but respond to the logic of their efforts to undermine my thinking, right? I mean, they weren't doing it for the right reasons, but it was like, yeah, these animals, the pigs in the form of pork chops or chicken in the form of chickens that are raised, they have lives that matter to them. They want to live. And I thought, just for gustatory preference, because, it tastes good or because it's convenient, is that a sufficient moral rationale to take the lives of these animals? So it was after that set of discussions that I became vegetarian and then a month later vegan. And it was really at that point that I felt a bit of the kind of moral inconsistency off my shoulders. I mean, I knew something was nagging at me. It just wasn't fully formed in my head until those very sharp questions came my way. But, I don't want to say you can't be an animal advocate if you're not vegan. I mean, I think that we should all strive and question and do as much as we can. And if that's where things lead you, great, because those animals suffer. But I also don't want to say that, I don't want to have a holier than thou attitude either. And I want to take people where they are, and I want them to do things that make sense for them. And I'd rather have, millions of imperfect people being active on animals than a couple thousand perfect people, in the sense of like, yes, you're perfectly consistent, you're checking all the boxes. And again, I'm not diminishing, striving to be the best you can, because that's what we all should be doing. But I also don't want this to be a club. This is a movement to help all sorts of animals, and we're all imperfect. We're doing the best we can. We should not settle for, anything less than that, but we also shouldn't, ward people off who want to do something good and practical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have worked almost your entire life really hard to pass laws that protect animals, and you've been very successful, as I mentioned in the intro. But there are many, many ways to advocate for animals. And changing laws and policies is, I have learned from you in the work that we're doing with the campaign Equal Milk for All, how slow and difficult it is, especially when it comes to farm animals. We can talk about wild animals in a bit too. Like, I don't know if I want to call it just ever so slightly easier to get our lawmakers on board with wild animals than farm animals, but farm animals are just, it's just almost impossible. And it just seems to take forever. And you got more endurance and grit than I do, because I don't think I could do just changing laws all day, every day. But why have you chosen, and why did you choose early on to focus on changing laws and policies for animals?
Well, Dotsie, thank you for that. And I know I don't have more endurance than you or more grit. You have demonstrated that in so many different ways in your life. But let me just say that I believe that animal advocates need to try to do it all. And when I got involved in the mid 80s, that was a time of real ferment for animal protection. PETA had been formed in 1980. Peter Singer wrote his book, Animal Liberation, in 1975. The germ of that book had come in the form of an essay in the New York Review of Books in 1973. And that Singer work had really stimulated a grassroots surge of animal activism. And PETA was one of the best and most important manifestations of that, but there were grassroots groups everywhere. Now, we were just at that point trying to have animal protection, animal rights, whatever vocabulary you use, be part of the discussion. And frankly, the whole kind of movement was marginalized in some ways. I mean, the notion of animal cruelty was definitely an established cultural norm. And we had animal cruelty laws that had been adopted, in the 19th century. In fact, some of them in the first half of the 19th century. But really what the more contemporary animal rights movement was about was logically applying anti-cruelty principles to institutionalized settings, to the meat industry, to the dairy industry, the egg industry, the animal testing sector, the wildlife management establishment, the fashion industry, and all the other sectors that use animals. And what you learn when you begin to examine animal issues is that animals are built into our economy. They're built into our social behavior. They're built into all sorts of recreational activities. And a lot of it is just kind of background noise for us. We don't understand that the daily decisions that we make have enormous consequences for individual animals. And as I began to understand that, I thought, well, we have to do all sorts of things. So I was doing direct action. I was taking over fur stores, leading a local animal rights group. I started to do hunt disruptions. I chased hunters around the woods. I had some pretty harrowing experiences doing that. You
chased hunters around the woods?
I did. In fact, I went to your home state of Kentucky at one point and had some really rough experiences out in the woods in Kentucky. I was arrested, maybe 12 or 13 times for animal activism. I freed pigeons who were kept in boxes and were about to be shot at a Higgins pigeon shoot in coal country of central Pennsylvania, took over fur stores, followed hunters around the woods. And part of that was not just to spare the animals the idea of being shot. It was also to challenge these hunter harassment laws that were adopted in the 1980s that essentially forbid you from going to where the hunting was occurring and speaking up and walking and talking with people. So it was really kind of bound up with animal protection, but also the ability to speak up and advocate for these issues. So I did that. I had, every weekend during hunting season, I was in some other place and following hunters around the woods, as I said, the first.
Just to ask about, was this hunt sabotage? You were trying to be noisy so that the animals wouldn't come, or were you trying to actually change the hearts and minds of the hunters?
No, I don't think you could really change them, although we did have some very cool discussions with people, out in the woods, but others would kind of walk us through the the bogs and the swamps and the thickets to try to, make it difficult for us, but it was fine for us. And I think it was really not about persuasion of those individual hunters, although we were polite to them and we were respectful and, understood that this was part of their worldview and their psyche. But we were trying to create an understanding that there was a moral controversy about this, that going out and recreating and shooting animals, there are other ways that you can experience nature and enjoy nature rather than shooting these creatures. And obviously, we thought like some forms of hunting are more unacceptable than others, like shooting the animals just for their hits, for a trophy, or shooting mourning doves where they have, barely any mass to them. There's no great value from a meat eating perspective of shooting a mourning dove because there's hardly anything left after you shoot the dove. So I think it was really in this period of the 80s when we were trying to be part of the discussion, and direct action was one way to be part of that discussion. But I realized that, my chasing, hunters around the woods and talking to them and challenging those hunter harassment laws, it had value. And that was the necessary stage of development for that issue to become part of the discourse, moral discourse in our society. And you have to press issues. You can't just be passive. The discussion is not just going to happen. It has to be instigated. But I felt like, that was never going to get us there for animals. And again, I don't denigrate it because it was important at the time for me. And I really appreciate others who were involved in this work. And we all, don't do the same thing at the same pace in the same way, right? Every movement is a mosaic. And that diversity of approaches and strategies has kind of aggregate value for our movement. But I felt like I really wanted to address the largest problems for animals. I wanted to address the meat industry and specifically factory farming and animal testing and wildlife management and the fur trade. And that, the only way you can do this is to create standards in society. And standards basically are moral and kind of cultural and normative standards, but they're also legal standards. And I felt like this has to be where our movement goes. And I had studied other social movements, both in terms of coursework, but also just personal interest. And it was like every social movement eventually has to channel more of its energy, strategies, resources into political advocacy. And I think when you're talking about animals who are so vulnerable to human actions, there's such an asymmetrical relationship between humans and animals. We hold all the cards. We have all the power. They are just there for the taking, or they are there for the protecting. And I thought that, we needed human agency here, and we needed to shield animals from torment. And I thought, I've worked on so many issues through the years. And to take an example of, dog fighting or cockfighting, take dog fighting. I mean, maybe there are 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, really active dog fighters in the United States. I'm not going to convince those people to stop dog fighting. I mean, I don't have enough time to talk to 50,000 people one-on-one to begin with.
Yeah.
But the only way to stop them is to make it a felony for them to engage in this malicious mistreatment of animals. So I thought that's what we have to do. And I was not, working to build something from nothing. We have anti-cruelty statutes that have been in the books. I was just saying we need to logically apply these standards to settings that we normally don't associate with animal cruelty practices. And that's been the task. And it's incremental change. And it's not for everyone. It's not the whole kit and caboodle for the animal movement. But I really, as I got older, I realized that the two big levers of change are government policy and leveraging the power of government to enforce our laws, but also to create standards. And the other big lever was to change corporate behavior. That, we live in a capitalist nation. It's, part of a representative government. And there are standards for these corporations. They don't just operate independently. It's not a pure free market. And during my, time of activism, I saw in the 90s, in particular the 1990s, a lot of corporations began to develop standards of social responsibility. And they had people in the C-suites, the executive suites, that really thought about corporate social responsibility. And I was like, okay, now we need to build on that standard as well. Just like we were building on anti-cruelty standards, we now need to build on corporate social responsibility standards. And why shouldn't animals be part of the picture? I mean, if we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about worker treatment, we're concerned about women's issues, we're concerned about the wide range of social concerns in our society, equal pay for equal work. I mean, all of these issues, why shouldn't we be concerned about animals? Because a lot of these companies at the center of their business are animals. I mean, the animal agriculture industry, the center of the enterprise, the thing that gives these companies their wealth are animals. And they forget about the fact that they have nerve endings and lives of their own and brains. It's like you guys should be the first ones thinking about doing the best you possibly can to give these animals a decent life.
They are their livelihood.
You should be innovating and figuring out other ways to do your business. I mean, you both have been so incredibly helpful on our Kangaroos Are Not Shoes campaign. I mean, Nike is a giant global brand, one of the biggest global brands in the world. They've innovated with all of their shoe models and running and golf and tennis and all the other categories of sport. And then even in soccer, they have all sorts of models that are vegan offerings for customers, yet they're still using a bunch of kangaroos for a few soccer shoe models for the soccer cleats. And it's like, just a few models for a global sport with an industry with a global footprint means 2 million kangaroos killed a year. This is totally unacceptable. And here you have Nike saying, well, we're such a great company and we have this environmental sensibility and we have an endangered species concern. Well, what about the damn kangaroos? How can you possibly reconcile these notions that you're concerned about animal welfare and environmental sustainability, and you're really precipitating the largest slaughter of terrestrial wildlife in the world? So when I think about corporate work and government work, those have been the pillars for me as I think about kind of the most effective use of our movement resources.
Your book, The Humane Economy, which is excellent. You show how companies can do good and do well for their shareholders at the same time. And they're more likely to, in fact, in this time when our standards for animals have risen. Can you give us an idea of how you've been working in like Dotsie said, in animal rights organizations and pro-animal organizations? Do you call them animal rights organizations? Because some people
whatever.
chafe at
Sure.
that.
Yes.
You were at 23, you became the executive director of Fund for Animals. How have the standards changed? And I'm specifically interested in the Animal Welfare Act, which seems to be talked about a lot, used a lot, that, our standards match the Animal Welfare Act. What do you think of that act?
Well, it's just one of those things that the animal movement really did not invest much in political lobbying and activities. I was astounded, right? I mean, you're talking about a movement that had its organizational beginnings in 1866 with the ASPCA, 1 year after the Civil War ended, and we dealt with this great moral crime of slavery. People began to, turn their attention to animals. And this was an urbanizing country with cities that were, beginning to draw more and more people. We were moving away strictly from kind of an agrarian economy and agriculture as the kind of mode of normal living. And you saw, pet keeping begin to rise. I mean, there's so many coincident factors. I mean, you really had the environmental movement also begin to stir in the 1860s as well. And most social movements are born of crisis, right? There's something that they're responding to. And the abuses are so acute and the problems are so severe that it stirs people of conscience to organize and act. And the big thing that was going on was settlement of the West in the United States. And the West, was always a shifting boundary, right? The West at one point was Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. And as we were settling the country, obviously there were Native Americans, there were communities of people who were living on that land, and they were being liquidated through a combination of, guns and biological disease. But we as a nation were just laying waste to the wildlife. I mean, the passenger pigeon was one of the most abundant species on the North American continent. I mean, there were flocks that would darken the sky for hours, according to naturalists. Billions of birds. We wiped them out in the span of really about 3 decades. And so when we developed the repeating firearm, and then we had the transcontinental railroad, so we can begin to move goods from the rural areas, the hinterlands, to these newly emerging cities where people were wearing, bird feathers in their hats for the millinery trade, and they were wearing beavers for fur. We were just seeing this massive liquidation with the emergence of markets and new technologies to kill animals and to transport them. And that was where kind of both the humane movement and also the environmental movement were born. And I feel like it's been so logical to think about creating standards. But, when I started in the early 90s doing ballot initiatives, there were no successful ballot measures done in the animal movement, none. And the work on Capitol Hill was so spotty. There was one really legendary woman named Christine Stevens who had founded a group called the Animal Welfare Institute, and she had been responsible for many of the gains that had been made in the 1950s and into the 60s. But we were in such an early stage of development, and I felt like this was just the path that we needed to travel. But I was amazed, Alexandra, how little strategy was being focused on in our movement, right? It was a lot of direct action, which again, you needed to have before, like you need to have the concept kind of percolate in society. It has to be discussed before you can have legislative action, right? You cannot have legislative action on a concept that is unpopular, right? So you have to begin to win hearts and minds. And I think that, you do that through exposure, but also through logic and science and investigations. I mean, the 80s were a period of time when investigations began to be done as well. And I think PETA was especially significant in conducting undercover investigations. And you've done, a lot of that work, Alexandra, more recently. And, you're sussing out whether these shoe retailers are actually selling kangaroo shoes illegally in California because it's forbidden under law. It's like that is part of the process of agitation. But let me just say that all of these things work together, right? You can't see legislation in isolation from corporate work or from cultural work or from publishing and academic research on these subjects. All of these things are important. I mean, our movement needs a big, important think tank. We need a big political advocacy arm. We need a big, corporate outreach operation. We need to, be in the earned media. We need paid media, all of these things to just drive these ideas and the reinforcing. When we did Prop 2 in California to stop the extreme confinement of laying hens, breeding sows, and veal calves, it was after that we went to all these corporations like McDonald's and Walmart and Costco and said, hey, look, the people are for treating animals decently. And you should not be purchasing these products. We know you're going to continue to purchase pork and eggs, but the very least you can do is not to source them from these factory farms that immobilize the animals. And I get it. Like, I've been a vegan for 37 years, 38 years. I'm not interested in that. But I also feel like those animals want to get out of the worst miserable conditions now. And there's a big schism. There's always been a big schism in the movement over animal welfare and animal rights. But it's like, I think we need to do it all. And I think that there's a big plant-based movement, and we have so many products available to people now. But also we need to give these animals relief right now. They're suffering horribly. They want to get out of these factory farms and at least have, days that are not filled with misery. every moment.
I actually learned a really good lesson because I used to look down on animal welfare and think, what are they doing? They're wasting time. We need to get to the hard ass stuff. And then I went to this city council meeting in Los Angeles that was going to decide on whether elephants would be able to be allowed to be in circuses that came to Los Angeles. And I was, so there were these different animal factions in the room, some of them, and I was this group, I was an abolitionist. You don't allow any circuses or any elephants, no matter what. And then there was the bullhook group that just said, you have to outlaw bullhooks. And I was like, what? They just want to outlaw bullhooks? Is that it? Take away the circuses. Well, the city council voted to disallow bullhooks. And I was really upset. But guess what? Without bullhooks, you cannot control elephants and you cannot have elephants in circuses. And I learned a huge lesson there is that sometimes those incremental steps are the biggest weapon that you can use to stop animal cruelty.
Well, listen, I applaud you for having the view, and you're correct that wild elephants should not be kept in captive settings. They shouldn't be performing silly stunts and tricks. But a lot of politics and a lot of animal advocacy is understanding what the potential is, right? I mean, there's no valor in beating your head against the wall and changing nothing. Mm-hmm. Momentum builds on itself, right? When you start to win, then you can win more and more and more. And I think that this is how you train activists. That's how they cut their teeth. They become stronger advocates. I see how when Dotsie came to Capitol Hill, she's so persuasive, right? She's got the facts, at her fingertips, and she's passionate. She's doing this for no other reason than she cares. That's like that work that she is now doing in politics is going to be transformative. It's just a matter of time. And the question is it going to take 6 months, or is it going to take 2 years, or what? And the reality is we're never going to solve all these problems, right? But this is the task that we have with animals, is that we cannot solve animal rights problems if you think of human-caused suffering as the contributing factor of the problem, because we have too many people, right? There are too many opportunities for interactions with animals, right? There are countless billions of animals on the planet. We've got 8 billion people. The number of interactions is incalculable. But if we can stop 30% of the suffering, or 50% of the suffering, or if we are really fortunate, 70 or 80%, what a fantastic set of victories for those billions of animals who are getting relief. Our human nature is at the root cause of so much of this. And I have just taken the very practical view that, thinking of football, if it's 100 yards, I'm going to scratch and claw for 2 yards. And if I can get 5 yards, you better believe it. If I can throw the bomb and, have a 70-yard reception, fantastic. But it's like, if all the defense is down, playing deep, and I'm not going to be able to complete a pass that's a 20 or 30 or 40-yard pass, I'm going to take the ground I can get, because animals' lives matter to them right now. And I don't really buy this animal rights, animal welfare thing. I think that's kind of a construction of the industry, right? Because they used to deny that animals had any feelings at all. And then they found that was untenable. And they began to embrace the animal welfare language, say, oh, we're for animal welfare. But these people, they want you to stop using any animals. They want a radical transformation of society that's going to mean that you're going to be terribly inconvenienced. You're going to pay more. Life's going to be different. Your quality of life is going to diminish if these people get their way. So that was their way of creating this sort of schism. And then at the same time, most causes, have an ideologically pure instinct that sometimes becomes more of like a pin on their sweater than it is like done for the right reasons. And And, again, I'm not saying that people who are trying to be ethically consistent and fighting for animals in that way are wrong. I'm saying that there comes with some of this behavior a clubby sort of attitude that often develops. And what we really need to have is, we need to be generally aligned on where the goals are, and we can then take different strategies and tactics to advance it. But at the end of the day, you have to be involved in policy, and you have to be involved in changing the behavior of corporations, because you cannot rescue your way out of the problem, right? I mean, the notion of rescue is inapplicable to farm animals. They're owned property in our society. There are billions of them. There are not enough sanctuaries to get more than just a small representative sample to show the animal nature of these beings. And I think it's great. I mean, I'm all for farm sanctuaries and the rescue of animals and the understanding that they are individuals when the industry tries to treat them as populations. But rescue is not going to work for us. It has specific strategic value in illuminating a problem. And also you're saving animals who are going to be dead, right? You'd rather be saved than not be saved. And if that's where the energy is and that's where money is, great, do it. But not to the exclusion of the larger imperatives to change the macro level circumstances for animals.
I believed in the rights of all species, and I was vegan, but really spending quality time with the animals and understanding all of the intricacies of their ways of communication and their personalities and their fears and their likenesses. And just, it was just so complex, is when it really sunk in so deep for me. And if you can get to a sanctuary, I don't think there's anything that is as resounding for your soul to recognize, like, they matter. Like, we have to stand up for them.
You're absolutely right. And I think that having people at the facilities to tell the stories of the animals, right? Because I drove by cows all the time. I mean, I saw cows, even growing up where I did.
Yeah.
And it was like, someone's like, oh, this animal had a mother, and look what happened. I mean, she was at a slaughterhouse and she ran away, or somebody,
jumped off the truck and
or somebody saved them. And like, look at their eyes. They're the same eyes that we have, and their heart beats, in the same way that our heartbeat does. And it's like that, the combination of kind of the guided tour of these animals with a little bit of a reminder of what's at stake is so powerful.
You mentioned with the Kangaroos Are Not Shoes campaign specifically, it is illegal in California to sell kangaroo leather, yet many stores in California are still selling them. And you mentioned dogfighting, and you don't have time to talk to 50,000 dogfighters. So the way forward is to make it illegal, dogfighting illegal. But in the case of cockfighting in my home state of Kentucky, the very officers who are there to protect and serve, the law enforcement officers, even though it has become illegal, cockfighting is illegal there, they don't shut them down because they are literally involved. They like to go to cockfights. So it's still happening all over the place. So this is, again, where your endurance and grit comes in, because there's a lot of times where laws are made and they're just not upheld. So is that a matter of time? How will we change entirely when things like this are taking place all over the country and all over the world, where we're going to talk about Prop 12 in a minute here, but where something is pushed through and voted for, and then nothing happens?
Yeah. No, that's a really important observation on your part. And that's why at Animal Wellness Action, we say we're there. This is the arm, the Center for Humane Economy is really about changing business and corporate behavior. Animal Wellness Action is about changing government behavior. And we say that one element of this is passing laws, but the second is enforcing them.
Yeah.
And, you don't just get immediate cultural change when you pass a law, right? I mean, look at the debates that we have over abortion, or look at the debates we have over guns. I mean, one side prevails in a particular ballot measure or a legislative fight or a court proceeding, but the dynamics are still at work. And you see a back and forth. It's like a tug of war. And, when you think about animal fighting, you think of that as kind of a morally settled issue. I mean, that's what I've been arguing. I couldn't believe it. And I wrote about this in The Bond, the first of the two books that I wrote, that I talked to one of my colleagues at HSUS in the mid 90s and said, give me the state of animal fighting. And they said, well, it's legal. Cockfighting is legal in 6 states. It's a misdemeanor in like 25 or 30 others. Dogfighting is a misdemeanor in 25. There's no federal enforcement of the existing law that is on the books and very little state enforcement. Like, okay. So that's when I got myself going, and I did 3 ballot measures in Arizona, Missouri, Oklahoma. They were fights. I mean, there was an organized cockfighting community. It was actually much larger than anybody thought. And I realized that was not going to be the end of it when we passed the ballot measure. I mean, immediately Oklahoma lawmakers who are aligned with the cockfighting industry, who would think that Oklahoma lawmakers would be aligned with the cockfighting? They introduced like 15 bills to overturn it. So we were playing defense and trying to hold on to the win. But then there's this enforcement piece. And now I'm struggling with it today. I mean, I'm trying to create an animal cruelty crime section of the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, so that we have capacity to enforce our laws to protect animals. And, law enforcement, think of all the statutes that exist. Think of the vast number of codes that law enforcement have to focus on. If you're not knocking at their door, if you're not screaming and hollering, they're probably not going to enforce a lot of these laws. And I have made it a big deal to do rewards programs for information on dogfighting and cockfighting, to have tipsters, to have hotlines, to conduct investigations, to give awards to law enforcement when they do this right. I mean, it is by no means the end of the game. It's the beginning. It's the end of the beginning to pass a law. And then when you think about farm animals, it's like when I was working on animal fighting, and have been working on animal fighting, including with animal wellness action, it was in 2021 that we finally banned animal fighting in every inch of U.S. soil, and then had court proceedings to affirm the authority of the federal government and the states to do this work. So this was a big moment for me after a 25-year campaign to have widespread legal activity and then also widespread illegal activity, to ban it all and to have a legal framework that could punch back against these people. But then you think of farm animals. When I started doing this work, when Gene Bauer and I were going around Florida for the first ban on gestation crates in 2001, it was a state of pre-regulation. There were no standards for farm animals. There were no federal standards. There were no state standards. It was an empty book. And it's been just, incremental progress. And then even when we passed, we've won every ballot measure on farm animals that we put on the ballot in Florida, Arizona, Massachusetts, California, and every one of them has been challenged in one form or another. And it's like, you cannot think that you're done. I remember when we won Prop 2, that was the same ballot in 2008 when Obama got elected the first time. Also on the ballot was Prop 8. California voters banned gay marriage. California voters. Think of the evolution of the gay marriage debate. California, a deep blue state, favored a ban on gay marriage 14 years ago. Yeah. Now that issue is completely shifted. You had a U.S. Supreme Court ruling saying that, gay marriage is part of privacy rights. And, you had the military with new standards. That issue of gay rights moved so quickly. And I think some of it had to do with so many people coming out right? So many people were closeted. And then when people started to come out, it's like, okay, that's my cousin, or that's my sibling, or that's my neighbor, or that's, Bob in the community. Like, it humanized the people who had that orientation. And this is part of why speaking up on being vegetarian or vegan is so important. It used to be that people hid this. Yeah. When I started in college, nobody knew how to say vegan, right? Vegan, all sorts of crazy phonetics on this 5-letter word. And now it's part of our discourse. And, when you have Burger King and other companies that are marketing their products with commercials, what a tremendous change. But it's just another stage, right? You cannot rest on your laurels there. You then got to take it to the next stage of development. And of course, this is why a lot of our adversaries, say, well, listen, this is just the first step, right? And that's the common
slippery
utterance.
slope.
The slippery slope. There's like, these people are going to do this today, and then they're going to do this tomorrow. So you got to stop them today. It's the same logic on gun control. You cannot have, a waiting period, or you cannot have an assault weapons ban, because that's going to be the beginning of the end of firearms that are privately held in the United States. So that is the tug and the pull and the dialectic that exists in any social movement. And, it's civil rights, and it's women's rights, and it's gun rights, and it's abortion rights or pro-life. I mean, these are the dynamics. And listen, if any of this was easy, it would have been done before. And we happen to have probably the most complex social movement that exists, right? We're acting as proxies for the victims who cannot speak for themselves. There are thousands of different species. They are used in almost every sector of the economy. Think of the big sectors of the economy: food and agriculture, resource extraction like mining, forestry, energy production, pharma and testing. And I mean, you could just go on, fashion, and, whether that's shoes or coats,
most
or
products,
jackets.
Most products, either they're made there's some animal in them, usually. So
so it's so complex, right? And that's why, I think a coherent ethic, a simple ethic, needs to be articulated that is a mainstream sensibility, right? The point is not to make this sound outlandish. The point is to make it mainstream. And that's why I've always believed that we should be talking about animal cruelty, right? Because we all now agree, and it's the law of the land to oppose cruelty to animals. We just don't recognize it as cruelty if it happens to occur in a legal setting. And I think that we as a movement need to embrace the mainstream sensibilities. And we happen to have these animals, who are so vulnerable, they're so innocent. So many people are connected to them. When I was a kid growing up in Connecticut, we chained our dog. We got, a dog from a puppy mill. Here I was a kid who loved animals. I made all the wrong decisions. I was totally clueless. And I try not to be so judgmental of people when they make the wrong decisions, and to then say, okay, I get it. That's explained. I also made some decisions that probably weren't in the best interest of the animals, but here's a better way forward. And most people now recognize that animals suffer. They recognize that cruelty to animals is wrong. They recognize that everything in the world changes, that innovation is part of the human experience. It's part of business. Why shouldn't we change?
But I want to push back a little bit, Wayne, on what you said about you feel that using the argument of animal cruelty is so important, because I feel like, yes, to a point, until it inconveniences humans too much. And then our speciesism kicks in and we put ourselves first. So, and you know this because we work together on the FDA Modernization Act, where a lot of that has to come from science, because it's about animal testing. And there's a real ethic among humans that we have to use animals to test medicines and drugs. so that humans will live. So the question of would you prefer your dog or your son is the pushback that people who deal with certain animal issues will tell you. So science has to come in, and in the end, science always wins in terms of you don't need animals, really. I believe that in the end, that's how science will always come out. Am I being
well, listen,
Pollyanna?
I want to credit you, Alexandra, and also Christina Hancock and Tammy Drake. I mean, you three really put the FDA Modernization Act into my consciousness. And then you had also spoken to Gary Michelson, a friend of mine, and an MD and a philanthropist. And together we launched this campaign not long ago to address the biggest category of animal testing, which is the use of animals for new drugs. Think of all the drugs out there: heart drugs, bone drugs, pain drugs, cognitive, recall drugs. There's everything. They're all over the TV. They're huge pharmaceutical companies that are global brands doing this work 7 days a week. And in the span of a little more than a year, we are on the cusp of passing the FDA Modernization Act. And I was part of animal testing and research debates in the 80s, and it was so polarized. There was so little progress. And I'm amazed at how quickly we're getting this legislation passed. It's going to be enacted, and it's going to be, the next step in getting away from the use of animals and unleashing human creativity and innovation of a 21st century variety to have better outcomes in drug development, cheaper drugs, more reliable drugs. And, we're just not going to have all these animal victims as part of the narrative of drug development. And you guys helped make that possible. But if it had happened, if you had come to me 15 years ago, it wouldn't have played out this way. And
that's true. We didn't have the science then. And I want to add for the audience is that this is an example of incrementalism, because we are not, the FDA Modernization Act is not banning the testing of animals. It's just asking for the expansion of testing methods that include non-animal tests. And we believe, right, Wayne, that eventually the animal tests, which have always been highly faulty, will disappear because the new tests are have so much more potential for human relevancy.
Yes, and one of the things that we did in our campaign, and again, the Center for Responsible Science, which you founded with Tammy Drake and Christina and Jerry Boss and Adi Gill and others, what we did in this political campaign was to use the framework that had been widely embraced by industry and government, which was the 3 R's when it comes to animal testing: refining techniques to minimize pain and distress, reducing the number of animals in a protocol. The second R is reducing. And then third is replace animals with non-animal methods where they exist. How can you have replacement if the government mandates animal testing for drug development, which was the whole purpose of the bill, is to eliminate the federal mandate for animal testing and unleash creativity and science and use better methods? Because as you've noted in your comments just a minute ago, animal testing is not particularly predictive of the human response to drugs. It fails in more than 9 of 10 cases. When a drug passes muster in the non-human animal tests, whether it's rodents or beagles or primates, and then it goes to human clinical trials, it fails in 9 of 10 cases. That is a terrible record. Dotsie is an Olympic athlete, and you think of sports, right? If you are in baseball and you get a hit 3 out of 10 times, you're batting 300, you're a starter, you may be an all-star. If you're a professional basketball player and you're shooting free throws, if you get 7 of 10, you're a pretty good pro, right? If you get 9 of 10, you're a great free throw shooter. Those are the expectations we have for success. Why is it acceptable to have failure rates of 90 to 95% with this paradigm in drug testing? It's ludicrous. So we are now pushing the federal government and pushing the pharmaceutical companies to have a new paradigm to use human biology-based methods, not trying to translate results from beagles or primates or rats to human beings, because we've seen that it's generally a failure, right? I mean, if you put enough money in a slot machine, you're going to occasionally get some money back, but it's not going to be a very good investment. And you're not going to get rich doing it. You're not going to be a big success. So if you're just focused on animals and testing, like, yeah, you're going to get some decent results, but my God, use human creativity. So I think that the animal testing issue, going back to your original question, Alexandra, which is how we gauge whether it's cruelty or not, right? We recognize that really gratuitous uses of animals, like staging a fight with dogs, provides no social benefit to society, right? You can recreate in 1,000 other ways. And, we know that the dogs suffer a great deal in the fight. So we put that on one end of the spectrum as cruel because of the effect on the animals, and the violence is totally gratuitous and replaceable, right? You can do something else. Then on the other end of the spectrum has been this animal testing issue that it's been posited by people in the industry saying, well, it's a human being or your dog, or it's a human being or a rat or a mouse, which, is even a sharper contrast for most people. But that's a false choice these days because the animal tests are not particularly good. And now we have these non-animal methods. So the boundaries of the issues are shifting, right? And in the 80s, they won that debate. Now we're winning that debate. And so much of politics and advocacy is about framing. And the framing is, I'm utterly confident in talking about almost any of the animal issues because the frame is right there for us. I mean, factory farming is a disgrace for animals. It's a disgrace for communities. Yeah. It's an undermining of our public health and environmental protections. It's an obvious form of animal cruelty when you immobilize an animal. So I feel like on all of these issues, we've got winning arguments. But anytime you're doing something big and there are billions of dollars at stake, you have an organized opposition, right? I mean, DOTSI's fighting one of the biggest, toughest industries that exists, the dairy industry. I mean, there's no more pampered industry at the federal level than the dairy industry. They get so many support, so many price supports and other forms of subsidy. And it's like, the deck is stacked. The government is on the side of the dairy industry. And that makes it tougher from an advocacy perspective when all you're trying to do in some ways is give kids an option. But I think the framing that she has settled on is really powerful and persuasive, which is that, 90% of Asian Americans and 3/4 of African Americans and other people of color have such high rates of lactose intolerance. Why would our government be force feeding kids a product that makes them sick? That's a winning frame to me. And I think that DOTSI's going to win that fight. It's just going to take a little while.
A lot of times, most times it comes down to the bottom dollar. And that's maybe part of the case in Prop 12 in California. I want to talk about that. And I do also want to talk a little bit about animal cruelty being the reddest flag for mass murders. We just cannot finish this podcast without going there as well. But Prop 12 in California, in you just saying a moment ago, the end of the beginning of something. And this Prop 12 reminds me of that very thought. In 2018, California voters approved a ballot initiative to prohibit the sale of products derived from the offspring of a pig or other farm animals, veal, egg-laying hens, who were confined in a cruel manner, quote, is what it said. And it was called, if I'm not wrong, the Prevention of Cruelty to Farm Animals Act. And it earned 7.5 million yes votes and prevailed with a 63% majority. And it did both Republicans and Democrats. So this act, as you can imagine, follow the dollar, has been challenged widely by the pork producers. And I remember just a few short weeks ago getting on a Zoom call with you where you looked just utterly disappointed and defeated and were just white a wash. I mean, the color was out of your skin. You got COVID, so maybe that was the beginning of that as well. But and you told me that the U.S. Solicitors General, who's under the thumb, if you will, of our Secretary of Agriculture, appealed to the Supreme Court in agreement with the pork industry in an effort to overturn California's Prop 12. And I, call me blonde or just out of it. I don't know. I just didn't know. I'm just starting this type of work. I had no idea that the people's vote could not count, or that the executive branch or the courts could overturn what the people had stood for and what they voted for and what they said they wanted to happen. So with this, what is it the crux? Is it just money, or are there other areas are there other pieces to this, of this decision by Thomas Vilsack and President Joe Biden, quite frankly? And how can we help fight it as people who vote? And yeah.
Well, Dotsie, your instincts on this are similar to so many people. You think if you have a democratic process, you have a constitutionally secured process, which is direct voting on laws that are put on the ballot by the people. There's a very difficult threshold. You basically have to get 1 million signatures of registered voters in California to put something on the ballot. You think if after you go through that, where you qualify, and then the opponents can spend endless millions of dollars to try to defeat it, confuse people, tear it down, find a little defect and say it's, goes too far. I mean, we all have seen these political campaigns, but when you have a route in favor of a measure, then you think, well, how could this be overturned? Well, the reality is it's a law, and all laws are subject to judicial review, and they have to be constitutional. And, the folks who did Prop 8 banning gay marriage, they won that vote in California, big surprise in 2008. But it was viewed as violative of the constitutional rights, basically, of those individuals. So that was struck down. So there's been a history of ballot measures being challenged in the courts. And all the ones that I've done through the years, they've all been upheld, basically. There have not been any animal measures that have been overturned, but this is the most serious effort. Now, the National Pork Producers Council, which is a trade association for the pork industry, which includes Smithfield, which is a Chinese-owned company, China, like the government of China, like communist authoritarian China, and then JBS, which is a Brazil-based agribusiness company. Those are two big parts of the National Pork Producers Council. I mean, foreign-owned agriculture is a big deal. So here you have, China's government and Brazil's, big corporation trying to take the votes away from American citizens. I mean, that's really partly what's at stake. But their argument is essentially that the states don't have the authority to affect commerce that extends beyond the boundaries of the state. So they basically, in their legal, vernacular, they're claiming an extraterritorial effect. And the reality is, we live in a representative government that has some direct democracy outlets in about half the states. We have local government, state government, federal government, and there is a balance and an interaction between all of them. The jurisprudence tells us that the states can enact standards that are grounded on the health and safety of their citizens. And of course, it's going to have some extraterritorial effects at times. Industries,
of course,
that operate nationally may have to deal with different state standards because the people of those states have those standards. But that's why this is such a
and with that argument, China and Brazil shouldn't have a say on our economy.
Yeah, right. Well, exactly. I mean, what they're basically saying is that, now remember, the National Pork Producers Council, they don't want any federal laws for animals, right? We have no federal standards for farm animals, none. They oppose things that are even outside the farm animal space because they don't want animal welfare to advance. So they want no federal standards, and now they're trying to gut state standards under the theory that Californians are having an impact on Iowa pork producers and North Carolina and Minnesota pork producers. The reality is California has done something that's eminently fair and legally defensible, which is we're saying that producers in California cannot confine sows so severely that they're immobilized. And if they want to sell pork in California, they have to abide by those standards. And they're saying the same thing applies to Iowa producers. If you want access to the California market, and no one's forcing you into the California market, that's your choice. Go sell, they sell vastly more pork to China than they sell to California. They sell it to Mexico. They sell it to Brazil. They sell it all over the world. And, they don't want to play by any rules. Yeah. They want to treat animals like pure instrumentalities. They don't support any animal welfare legal standards. They have their voluntary standards, which are basically meaningless. I mean, how does it have meaning if an animal cannot even turn around? If they can take 2 inches, pigs are widely recognized to be sociable, intelligent animals, often compared to dogs in terms of their cognitive abilities, problem solving, social ability. If you did this to a dog, if you kept them in a cage that was barely larger than their bodies and you kept them in there for 3 years, you'd be rightly accused of cruelty. This was on the ballot. The pork industry is just relitigating the campaign. Are saying, this is going to have a devastating impact on the pork industry. Californians knew what they were doing. They knew exactly what was going on. We heard all of these arguments. They said, you in Los Angeles, you're going to pay higher prices for pork. You're going to drive these farmers out of business. And California said, I don't think so. You just give the animals a little space. That's not too radical an idea. So we face a threat. Our side has won every legal challenge that's thus far been advanced in U.S. District Court, multiple venues, in the Ninth Circuit. But now the Supreme Court granted review of this petition. And typically the court only grants review if there's some sentiment that maybe the lower courts got it wrong. So it's a very threatening circumstance. And the Biden administration and his Solicitor General, a political appointee, coming out and favoring the overturn of states' rights. I mean, this makes no sense from a political perspective for the Biden team. The Biden team is likely to face a Republican-controlled House, possibly a Republican-controlled Senate. They're going to want, on climate change and other priorities, the states to be doing important things to address these problems. Of course, climate change is not just interstate, it's global. They're basically, tying themselves in with industries that want to nullify democratic decision-making at the state level, leave everything to the feds that are controlled by agribusiness and have such inordinate influence. I am appalled at the Biden administration. It's complete inattention to animal welfare. The range of bad appointees, from Tom Vilsack, the agriculture secretary, who didn't do anything on animal welfare during his first 8 years with the Obama administration, has now an unprecedented, third, 4-year period basically to run this agribusiness agency. Just terribly disappointed. I cannot believe they would seek to undermine states' rights. And of course, you have a lot of conservatives like the Heritage Foundation and others that talk states' rights, but have filed amicus briefs in favor of the Pork Producers Council to eviscerate states' rights. I don't get any of this discombobulated thinking. It's really not that they're for states' rights. They're just for industry right. having no responsibilities and no duties, essentially.
Right. And almost the exact same time, Roe versus Wade puts the power back into the states' hands. States' rights.
Yeah, right. So there's so many contradictions in their thinking, and they have a lot of the big ag state attorneys general that have filed amicus briefs. So the pork producers have kind of lined up as many people, but our side is going to make an argument. I can only hope that the 9 justices take an honest look at the facts. The idea that the pork industry in Iowa is going to be transformed is just false. California represents less than 10% of the sales of the pork industry. And already 30+% of pigs are out of gestation crates because of the campaigns that we've been conducting, for the last 20 years. That capacity to supply California exists right now. It's just it's a fabrication. And really, what is the pork industry going to do when McDonald's and Walmart and Costco and the others fulfill their public pledges? All of these companies made public pledges to stop sourcing pork from operations that confine the sows so severely. So, of course, they have the logistical capabilities to get this done. Of course, they have the housing know-how to get it done. This is just the pork industry trying to relitigate this issue. They lost at the ballot. These are the same arguments that they had. And they had to convince, 5 or 6 million people in California to vote against the measure. They didn't. They lost in a rout. And now they think, okay, all we need is 5 justices of the Supreme Court to nullify the votes of 7.5 million Californians plus 2.2 million Massachusetts voters, because we did a similar ballot measure in 2016 in that state. So that'll be wiped out. And then you could see all sorts of other laws. If California bans the trade in ivory, are piano makers who want to use ivory then going to say, well, okay, that is interfering with our commerce. We need ivory keys for our pianos. And is that now that law against the trade in ivory from California going to be on the chopping block, or the shark finning ban? Or what about Nike and kangaroo skins? That's interrupting Nike's commerce. They want to be able to sell kangaroo-based shoes in California. Well, California voters don't want it. Lawmakers don't want it. Well, we'll go to the courts to get that overturned. This idea that the states cannot stop animal cruelty that's connected to commerce is diabolical.
I'd be remiss if we did not dive into an article, that profound article that you wrote that's titled "Animal Cruelty is the Reddest Flag of All for Mass Murders." And this is connected to the violence in the recent school shootings and the not so recent school shootings. And in the article, you speak about the fact that policy solutions should factor in animal cruelty as an antecedent to extreme acts of violence, because there are so many powerful examples, and you cite some of them. One is teenage gunman Peyton Gendron, arrested for gunning down 13 people in Buffalo at a supermarket on May 14th, had stabbed and decapitated a feral cat in March. Salvador Ramos, the 18-year-old who massacred 19 children and 2 teachers in his school, allegedly boasted to friends that he tortured animals.
It's documented in the academic literature when it comes to social violence. It happens in homes where there's domestic violence. One day it's a spouse, another day it's a child, another day it's a companion animal. We know that factory farming is correlated with all sorts of public health concerns, environmental despoilation, animal cruelty. We see at dogfights and cockfights, not just illegal gambling, but often narcotics traffic, human-on-human violence. We see with the mink industry, with the cruelty that it commits against these animals to basically, kill these wild animals on factory farms. We know that zoonotic diseases flourish at these wild animal factories, and no species of non-human animal is a greater threat of spawning a variant than mink on these factory farms. And I think all of this really is in the bucket, Dotsie and Alexandra, that animal issues and the violence that we see meted out against animals cannot be isolated. We see that it bleeds into and intersects with all sorts of other social concerns in our society. And that when we're good to animals, we see more empathy. It's like exercising a muscle. That empathy becomes stronger when you exercise it. And when you don't exercise empathy, you just have moral numbness. And we see in so many cases that these people who commit heinous acts of murder, they often have started their murderous ways on innocent animals. And
they might have been born without empathy, as a sociopath would be defined.
Yeah, they may not have any empathy at all, or there may be, some other psychological stuff going on, but we fail to pay attention to animal cruelty and our peril. And this is why I think animal protection is a place where you as an individual can do more to reduce suffering than by being involved in any other cause, because animals are so at risk, but also they're so tied in with so many other social concerns in our society. When we think about the animal agriculture industry and its contribution to, greenhouse gas emissions and, tampering with the life systems on our little blue-green planet here that's very vulnerable. I mean, there's so many consequential things that we do. And a lot of times the opponents of animal protection, the adversaries of change, they try to cast it as animals versus humans, that somehow by elevating animals, we're demeaning humans. It's quite the opposite. When we elevate animals, we enhance our humanity and we make the world safer for all of us. And it shouldn't require these dramatic case examples of these murderous, individuals, typically young men or late teen boys, doing this terrible stuff to get us to wake up when it comes to animal cruelty. We shouldn't have to do this, but oftentimes, we don't see leadership in the Congress. We don't see leadership among our politicians. They default to kind of the predictable patterns of policy response. And I'm just waiting for someone to be creative enough to connect these dots. It doesn't really take much. So it's disappointing to see that not enough politicians are making these connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it starts somewhere. And it started with that article for me to really connect the dots. And it's the end of the beginning. So thank you for writing it. And yes, the hardest working man in the animal rights biz that either one of us know. This has been such a pleasure. Yeah. I have learned so much from you, even just on this podcast. So I know that our listeners have, and just thanks for spending time with us.
I appreciate both of you so much. You guys you're so purely motivated. You're such great advocates. You are so other-centered. You're always willing to help outside of your, immediate campaigns, to dive in, to assist me and so many others. So thank you both so much for all that you do.
Yeah. So everybody go to animalwellnessaction.org and Center for Humane Economy.org to see more about the amazing, tireless work that Wayne is doing with his team. And of course, check out his books. The Humane Economy is really a great, great book, and The Bond. So thank you, Wayne, for spending all this time with us today.
Thank you both.
Hey, folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switchforgood.org. That's podcast@switchforgood.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.